when I put those together, I try to kind of create, even for myself, but also for my audience, like, why do these all sort of work as a group? Mm-hmm. And that's part of my challenge because they all look so different. Like, I think that they're recognizable as my work, mm-hmm. but they are different enough that, you know, if I showed you these two pieces, you might be like, they look pretty distinct, you know?
Right.
So it's just an organizational thing, too, to try to help people sort of see them as a collective.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So as you're working with the collage, is there a process that typically kind of manifests itself? I mean, do you have a shape? Do you have a shape in mind to start with? Are you looking for a particular form? Do you just kind of let the different pieces speak for themselves? You know, do you kind of start with, different colors in mind and how they're going to go, or where do you...
So what happens is when I'm tired, when I have days that I'm not very but I know I have some time,
right?
But I don't really want to commit to I don't have the kind of mental energy to start working on a piece. I will literally sit down, with a glass of wine and start tearing out pages of things that look interesting to me, and not even very carefully cutting, just sort of cutting and sorting. So I'm kind of almost like a processor.
Right.
This looks interesting to me. I think I want to use it, but I'm not sure what. And they just end up on a big pile on the floor. And then, and then there's this kind of a second refinement, which might happen again when I'm not really that, but I'm going back through. Then there are other days when I just really want to be more in that sort of editorial, and that's when I start trying to put things together. And in that way, really is almost I feel like it's a movie screen, because I get these big pieces of board, and I've started moving to museum board because it's a little stiffer.
Right.
I worked through all my arts paper, and I was like, you know what? Again, it's one of those things do I go out and try to go track down more of the same paper, which I got years ago in a huge box.
Right.
And I was like, no, I'll just, this museum board's good. So, but some of them are pretty big, and they're kind of almost like a little movie screen size, shrunk down, rectangular. And I move them around, and it's like looking under the microscope and seeing amoebas moving around.
Right.
Sometimes I thought I need to do stop motion, because they do sort of change. And I use my camera a lot. My camera on my phone.
Here's the video work that you're going to start developing. It's going to be an animation, right? And just start, that I bet we could really bump up your Instagram followers by posting
some animated, because well, that's what happens is when you get sort of road days where you've looked at something so much, or you've driven down the road and you're starting to have that, your mind's wavering. Right. What I do is I get them to a point where I think maybe this will work, and I'll take a picture with my camera phone, and then if I move it around, I'll take another picture. So nothing's glued down yet, but that's why I said it almost feels like animation, because I can look through 3 or 4 or 5 of these and I see them moving around. But it's a good way for me to actually see compositionally which one feels better. And it's not about looking better, it's about feeling.
Right.
Because for these things, they really have to feel like they just came together.
Right.
And so when I start to feel like something is too forced, that's when I don't glue anything.
Yeah.
Because I know that I'm just trying to make something work, and the whole point of them is that they should sort of feel like they little organisms that they bumped up against each other or something.
Sure.
And then when I do get that feeling, I actually do use my phone to kind of keep an eye on, but they're not traced out and glued exactly. I just work them up, and they have some of them have levels. So when I put them down by nature, some of the material floats up a little bit because it has a different weight.
Right.
And sometimes I like that, and so I'll back that and let it pop up, so it becomes a relief.
Sure.
And that just happens also as part of the process of putting all these different layers together.
Right. So in the past year, there was this body of work I was kind of working on the side where I was doing these organic abstractions as part of paintings. And I was just like, I don't know what I'm going to do with them, but I'm just going to make them and make them and make them. And at some point I decided, you know what, I want to start cutting out the organic shapes, and that's going to create pieces where there are positive shapes and negative shapes, and I can reassemble them because each one had a different color theme. And so I started cutting out these paintings and reassembling them as collage. Mm-hmm. And I hear a lot of what you're saying in that process, and because part of the anxiety is like, okay, is this good? Can I make it better? Am I going to forget what good was? I need to document it.
Right. Yeah.
And, in case I totally go in the wrong direction, I can backtrack. But then, I find myself getting to a point where, oh, wow, I really like this collage. Now I have to disassemble it to adhere it to the surface.
Yeah.
And so I assume there's some of that in there, right? Because it's all free and floating.
Yes.
Until you get to the point where, like, okay, I really like this, and now do you have to? How do you?
That's tough. That's a tough part because it's not ever going to come out exactly the same as what that moment. And I think that's the thing about collage is that it's very liberating, and then all of a sudden can be really tough because you want to keep that freshness, but you can make a slight adjustment and it becomes something totally different.
Right.
And so I know this sounds really weird, but I've just sort of trusted almost like, it's kind of like I think of it as like basketball players that practice all day long and take shots, and then you just get in the game and you just sort of rely on like a whole lot of time of practice to help you hopefully get that shot in the basket.
Right.
But occasionally it doesn't work.
Sure.
And then it's like, and then I've had to look at it and be like, do I just live with it, or do I try to add to it or change it or fix it? And I've done both. And it's collage is a really weird thing because you are working on the premise of like you're the omniscient, or what is it, omnipresent, like manipulator in the background, and you want these things to sort of be on their own, but you're also the editor behind it, and how much do you kind of just let it go? And so I've had moments where I got too much glue, and then when I try to clean it up, it rubbed off part of the surface, and things happen. And I think that's just goes with a little bit with the territory of, it's like overpainting, that happens with painting.
Right.
I was going to say one thing that you asked me earlier that I thought about was, I don't know if this happens to all artists where we gravitate towards certain kind of mark making, where, some people like striation or a certain kind of mark. And I have a tendency to cut out globularly, and so a lot of my work have become sort of these like rounded figures, and I kind of have to fight that sometimes. And one of the things that I found a good way to do that, well, there's two things. One was with a new set of magazines, I actually started cutting out edges rather than just cutting material out of the center, because that's when I found I kept making like little cloud shapes.
Right.
And that forced me to deal with new edges and new like negative space and things that weren't there. And then the other is sometimes just like when I cut stuff out, and the good thing about magazines is they're printed on both sides. Sometimes you flip it over and you're like, oh, that's a weird shape, and you cut out that chip and you flip it over, and there's like, it's kind of deconstructed for you. Sure. So you can step away from that repetitiveness that happens, and I think it's fairly accidental, but it's just this kind of tendencies. Like we have like a gate, right? So I have like a scissor gate. Like I start to make a little curve, and I'm like, oh, I'm cutting out circles again. Yeah. So
when you're, you've got the big pile, and there are all these textures in the large scale, and so say you're working on a piece, would you have already? would you have already cut out that shape, or would you say, okay, I need something else on this particular piece? I want something in this color range. And you dig through the pile and you cut a shape, at that point to put on there.
Sometimes I do that, but mostly now I'm really trying to. So I rely on in the cutting stages, cutting out a lot of interesting things, and then trying for the most part to just be like editorial and make them work together as much as I can. Mm-hmm. And I can't say it's a color or texture thing, though there is some of that, because there is just kind of this natural tendency to like find tonal ranges, I guess.
Right.
A weird thing that's happened to me is, and I know this sounds crazy, but like none of this color is something that, if as a painter, I would have ever chosen. Mm-hmm. I find them to be very bright and pop, and like when I look at what I used to paint, it was a complete opposite.
Right.
Like it's not my range or my palette at all. So there's something sort of funny where they're, and again, that's a good challenge for me, because it's like moving me away from where I'm totally in control of things. But yeah, there are moments when you just like, you need something and you kind of feel it, and then it's like you do look for something to fit in there. And
so you feel like you like if you were left to your natural proclivity, the colors would be far more subdued.
Yes.
And that media just as in nature, it's just far more saturated because it's trying to attack us with, publications are trying to attack us with color, and that highly saturated color is what you're working with. Yes.
Now here's a cool thing about like Instagram, all those like features. Mm-hmm. When you're playing around with it and you see what it could look like in another sort of filter.
Right.
So this is where I'm going right now is, I said I wasn't going to learn Photoshop, and now I've got Photoshop and I'm learning it, because I'm like, if I'm going to print these large, there's nothing wrong now with me like saying, okay, this was the source, I did all this handwork. Now I want to, play with the color and see how I can get a better handle on it. Because like the piece that was at Kirk Hopper, I really liked a lot of the things about it.
Right.
It's a bit, not garish, but it's very bright. And it's like almost to the point where I'm like, God,
is that the one that's kind of relief, that's a really warm tones? Yeah, that's really lovely.
Yes, thank you. And but I'm like, I want to see, what would it look like if I did it in a different kind of desaturated or different range, like just as a way to play. So back to that thing of like, how much is hand, and then like the digital is a tool. It's a really cool tool.
You could adjust the hue, and you could just like keep the exact same image and like go just somewhere else on the spectrum for each one.
Right. So that's one thing I'm starting to play with. The other thing is, all of a sudden, that I've discovered this really interesting texture by accident, because when you have magazines and you pull tape or it gets wet, sometimes the ink bleeds, or you have this kind of pulling off of the surface material. And so I've started doing that kind of intentionally. Like I'll get I feel like I'm giving all my trade secrets away.
Yeah, you can stop at any point you want.
I get like a what do you call it, a paper towel and get it moist, and then just sort of pick up a little bit of material. I think printmakers do these kind of things, and it's really interesting because it's now relying again on hand mark making, and then I can go back in and print that digitally, and that adds another layer, because you're like, oh, I'm looking at a printed material, but is that an accent that was there, or is it added? Like, so I like all of that kind of stuff. I think it keeps it fun,
Sure.
So yeah.
So this latest group show at Kirk Hopper, there's that piece that we were just talking about. There are a couple of pieces in the back that, that didn't seem to fit in these like 5 categories you have thus far, and they were sort of radiating around a central point,
right?
And were related to specific fabrics. Like I think one was like bandana, and the other one was like serape,
right?
And so, what are you exploring there?
Well, so, it's interesting. The show was curated by Giovanni Valderas, and he came to the studio, and